Hello, good morning. I want to welcome all the attendees to this panel discussion. My name is Stephen Weber. I'm Chief Medical Officer and Executive Vice President at the University of Chicago Medicine. For better or worse, I am an epidemiologist and infectious disease doctor, which again has been either a really good thing or a really bad thing over the last year and a half. But today our focus is going to be elsewhere with really a guest panel talking a little bit about vaccines and some of the perspectives from a management and business standpoint. And I think what we'll gain are some insights, not only to the specific work that's unfolded over the last year and a half, but hopefully a look forward in terms of some of the lessons that we learn as we all not only emerge from the pandemic, but try to apply those lessons learned in our own business work and in our lives. So indulge me for a minute. I'll just briefly introduce our three panelists and welcome them. First, I'll introduce Jim Kiltz. Jim is a founding partner at Centerview Capital. He was a founding partner, and it's a private equity firm which was founded in 2006. Previously, Jim served as chairman of the board, chief executive officer, and president of Gillette until it merged with the Procter & Gamble company, at which time he became vice chairman of the board of Procter & Gamble. Of note for our discussion today, Jim is a former board member on Pfizer, which obviously one of the major contributors in terms of the vaccine development. Jim received his bachelor's degree in history from Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, and later earned his MBA from the University of Chicago. I'll next welcome Stan Erck. Stan is the president and CEO of Novavax, another major player in the vaccine space around COVID-19. Stan was named president and chief executive officer of Novavax back in April of 2011. He became a director in June of 2009 and served as executive chairman of the board beginning in February of 2010. Stan has extensive experience leading companies around immunology and life sciences, and I know his perspective is especially timely right now given some of the activity around the Novavax vaccine. Rounding out the panel is Bob Nelsen. Bob is a managing director and co-founder of Arch Venture Capitals. He joined Arch at its founding and played a significant role in the creation, early sourcing, financing, and development of more than 100 companies, including over 30 of which will receive valuations exceeding $1 billion. In those cases, many, again, a large player in the life sciences space and with a lot of experience and understanding in the business that we're talking about today. I'll add that Bob also holds an MBA from the University of Chicago and a BS from the University of Puget Sound with majors in economics and biology. And just to tie in the Booth connections, I should add Stan received his undergraduate degree from the University of Illinois and a master's in business administration, again, from the Booth School of Business. So we're going to go ahead and get started then with the panel. Again, welcome all of you and all of our attendees to the meeting today. Again, I said that the framework is really around what are the lessons learned. So let me start with that and give you each a chance to introduce yourselves on the same question. You know, in many ways, the accelerated development and release of the vaccine has been not only a major public health accomplishment and huge clinical benefit, but a critical achievement in the interplay between business and science. Each of you has a unique perspective in this space, and maybe I'll just start with Jim and ask you, what's the singular lesson learned? If you had to condense these 15 months plus of experience, what's the biggest takeaway you're seeing in that intersection between biology and science?
Well, as a board member of and director of Pfizer, I had a front row seat to the development and manufacture of the first COVID vaccine. And I had the opportunity to observe our CEO, Albert Bourla, and his team in action as we went through this. I think the biggest lesson learned for me was that leadership really matters. And it's leadership in business management, in science, and in politics. And, you know, let me just make a couple comments on the business leadership. People many times don't know what they're capable of, and they need to be challenged when we are faced with what seems to be an impossible task. And I got to tell you, 15 months ago, developing a vaccine in record time seemed like an impossible task. It's important to note that the typical vaccine development takes 5 to 7 years. And given the severity of the pandemic, typical, we recognize, was not good enough. And we challenged the management team and the scientists and the logistics people especially to come back with an accelerated timetable. And they came back with a record timetable, 18 months. We can get from here to there in 18 months. And they were very proud of that. we said that was a record time, but it wasn't good enough. And our CEO said, we need to blow up this entire process. And we were able to deliver the submission in 9 months, which is half the original time that we thought was a record. And how that occurred was we did things in parallel that would normally have been done sequentially. And we focused on removing roadblocks. And one of the key things you realize during one of these crises is the leader needs to remove the roadblocks. And the roadblocks come in many forms: resource constraints, bureaucratic processes, and in the way issues and challenges always pop up along the way. And how do you deal with those without getting stuck? Well, one of the biggest things we did was we wrote a blank check on resources. The CEO basically told everybody, if you think you might need it, order it. And, to the tune, I think we originally committed $2 billion. We figured it would cost us $2 billion to do this. And one of the most important things, I think, as we did this, we decided we would not take government funding and instead self-fund the effort. And it was very clear that we thought that taking outside money would result in a lot of reports, a lot of inputs. Whenever people give you money, I think our CEO said it on Face the Nation, whenever anybody gives you money, they want some kind of control or response. And we just couldn't get bogged down with bureaucracy or second guessing, because there's a very small core of people who need to do everything. They have the knowledge, they have the expertise, and you just need to let them turn loose on what's important. We created an executive committee, met multiple times a week, included all key decision makers. We cut time, hours, days, weeks off the timetable by doing that and forcing decisions to be made very quickly and getting the issues on the table very quickly. And I guess another thing that we did during this whole process was you recognize you really had to think big to overcome the challenges. You had to put your best minds on things early. And I think one of the biggest challenges, once we got approval for the vaccine, was the distribution of the vaccine was a huge issue. I never saw a logistics issue. When we sat and talked about this early on, how do you deliver hundreds of millions of vaccines to the world when it needs to be shipped and stored at minus 80 degrees centigrade? Nobody's ever done that before. And it was pretty exciting to see it happen. We thought big. We did 4 freezers at the Kalamazoo plant. Each freezer farm was as big as an NFL stadium, capable of storing 100 million doses of the vaccine. We came up with the novel thermo control RFID application in the shipper and storage area. We created our own tower. We kept track of all the inventory across the world, and 24/7 temperature control and location control. And we managed to deliver 350 million doses, 150 million to the US, to 86 countries with a 99.9% shipping accuracy. So I think what I take away from that, the lesson learned is leadership does make a difference. Things that make a difference are challenging people, removing roadblocks, and thinking big. And I'll leave it there for now.
Jim, that's great. I think you opened up enough discussion subjects to carry us for 2 or 3 of these sessions. That's fabulous. And I think how it follows from leadership is a great segue to Stan. Stan, you're in a unique role with respect to Novavax and your own leadership. Maybe you could take the same question. Lessons learned thus far in the work that you've overseen.
Sure, thank you. And I agree with all the comments Jim made. It's interesting to come from my point of view and look at the world. I've been in biotech for 40 years now, basically my entire career. And as it turns out, I've actually been in vaccines for the last 20 years. And in all those 20 years, I've been working on pandemic vaccines. So this magic overnight thing that things happen in a year or so is our little company has actually made 2 influenza pandemic vaccines, one for something called H7N9, another one for H5N1. We actually I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, made the H7N9, when that was circulating in China and coming this way. You know all about this. We actually we got to, from the date the gene sequence was known for that virus, we got into humans in 91 days. And it actually got published in the New England Journal. And so we've done it before. We've made an Ebola vaccine. We've actually made 3 coronavirus vaccines, one for SARS 10 years ago, one for MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome 5 years ago, and now, of course, COVID-19. And we come from a very different perspective than Pfizer, in that Pfizer had the luxury of not taking government money. We had, and I think I give a lot of credit to what Pfizer and Moderna have done. And we're all the vaccines are all making the same antigen, the same protein, the spike protein as it's known. We're just making it a different way. And so we all have different approaches to that. And so far, all of them are working very well. We've all generated better than 90% efficacy, but Pfizer and Moderna have really done a great job of getting it quickly. We're rounding that corner. We're near. We've got 2 efficacy studies, one in South Africa, one in the UK, both of which showed that our vaccine is not only very efficacious against the Wuhan strain, but then these variants that you're hearing about. We're actually the only company that has actually done an efficacy trial with both the UK variant and the South African variant. We didn't plan it that way, but that's what was circulating at that time. And so we have really good data about how the vaccine works with the different variants. So our story is a little bit different. And I have to say, a year and a half, so this is April, 15 months ago when the gene sequence was first identified, my company had just gone through a downsizing because we had a phase 3 clinical trial results that in another respiratory virus that didn't meet our endpoints, and our stock went down 90% in one day, which is what happens to biotech companies when you don't make your primary endpoint. And we had roughly 100 people in the U.S. and 50 people in Sweden making what's called an adjuvant. And we had a market cap of, I think, $100 or $120 million. We had $80 million of cash in the bank, and we had enough money to get us through the next 5 months or 6 months. And so as it turns out, we did what we've done many, many times, which is we made the gene sequence, we got it into mice, we got it into non-human primates, and had just spectacular data in primates, and which almost always translates to humans. And we went from that stage to where we are today, which is with a couple $1 billion in the bank and a market cap of, I don't know, it fluctuates $1 billion every day, but say $15 billion and 800 and some odd people. And so we've hired all those people in the last 9 months. So I agree with Jim, it's leadership, not just mine, but the leaders inside the company that said, we did the same thing. We said, there is no such thing as a cash barrier. It's time. Time is the only thing that matters here. And you just pull out the stops and communicating that it's really hard. So it's all communication, because people are used to following rules, right? People are used to having restrictions and going through processes. And we just said, you cannot do that. And that's how we got to where we are today. And so, and hopefully with an approved vaccine in the coming months.
It's great. So the takeaways so far are unlimited budget and do what you want, right?
That's exactly right.
Good. So that's good.
But we have the one constraint that Pfizer did not have is we had to take money.
We're gonna come back. I'm eager to talk specifically.
Yeah, go ahead. I could talk all day about that one.
I think so. Bob, a different perspective and a complementary perspective, especially in some of the things that Stan was just sharing. What are you seeing as the lessons learned from your vantage point thus far?
Well, I'm going to both be congratulatory and throw a wrench in the discussion as well. So I think investing in advance of problems is the lesson, because we're all great at executing against a specific problem, and basically you can see it with Novavax and manufacturing and regulatory. You can see it with Pfizer scale up. You can see it with Moderna and the other vaccine companies. Exclamation point on J&J and AZ. We're not prepared actually to scale these things in any manner that is, allowing us to deal with India, deal with this faster, deal with the 200 million people who are immunosuppressed in Africa who are busy incubating variants right now. And, you cannot vaccinate with vaccines that are probably even not mRNA, although Novavax, those are my two favorite vaccines are here. But I think that while we did great, human decisions matter, right? So the decisions, kind of not to fund infectious disease, the decisions, not to shut down fast enough, the decisions to wait 4 weeks to schedule an advisory meeting for a vaccine that we know is going to work. So when the regulatory apparatus is still moving, they think fast, but I think slow. So I'm unhappy. I started National Resilience after spending a lot of time with Veer on the therapeutic side, which I also started, because I was unhappy with the speed, right? We're all congratulating ourselves that millions of people died and it cost us $20 trillion. And I don't think that's okay. I think a year is way too long. I think we can do way better. And I think we're going to be dealing that, there's a 5 or 10% chance we're dealing with a nasty version 2 of this. I think we're 90% chance going to be done after done in a relative term, like vaccinating every year, keeping ahead of it. But you can see what's happening when the system breaks down in India, right? That almost happened in the US, very, very close. And so, we have to move much faster, which means that we have to anticipate the problems and have things ready prior, or we have to have systems that can scale much more quickly in a decentralized fashion. So that's why I started Resilience, is essentially to create that infrastructure in the private sector to be able to move faster. So, I'm not happy with a year, and I'm not happy with any aspect of it. And the fastest thing and the most interesting thing about it is the development time in mRNA, but the scaling and the rest, even though we did a great job, if you just took a snapshot of where we are, you would not be happy, especially if you're one of the 600,000 Americans who died while we were fucking around, and the FDA was, taking a while to schedule meetings, right? I think there needs to be a lot of government kind of rethinking, and they are doing that. And the private sector, public sector piece of this really did work in some ways. And, it was super clear. And I think both Jim and Stan mentioned this, like the focus on doing the right thing in the industrial companies was just incredible. And every day, I was talking to CEOs who were doing they just wanted to do the right thing the fastest way. And I think government was the same way, but the bureaucracy still exists in these systems. So we do need, to rethink the system, and we don't have a lot of time to rethink it. Because there is a chance that we're dealing. I mean, every nasty actor on the planet, a terrorist group, a state actor, knows to differentially hurt the US, you make a respiratory virus. And the virus itself is percolating in 200 million immunosuppressed people that are not vaccinated in Africa and, cancer patients and other places. So if we don't get ahead of that, this 5 or 10% chance of a variant evading, spike protein vaccines, you know, it's possible, right? And so I'm not super worried about it, but 5 or 10% is 5 or 10%. So we have an opportunity to rethink how fast we can go. And it's interesting to see that's not happening, right? Those 200 million people who are incubating this virus over and over again, you know, the WHO and COVAX and everybody's talking about it, but there's nobody sticking mRNA vaccines in their arms right now. It's not.
Yeah.
So anyway, so I'm happy and unhappy at the same time.
No, I think, I mean, I'll tell you, you capture the spirit of a lot what we see in the care delivery space around. There's no, and one's caution, no one on this panel obviously is taking a position of saying, you know, there's no silver linings to anything that accumulates this kind of body count for sure. And then secondly, that you know, how do we prepare and going forward? So to that point, and I can throw this to any of you. So what are the features between these events? You know, Bob said, and I think it's fair to say that the response has been well-intentioned across the board and particularly effective in some of the segments that we've talked about here. What are the characteristics and qualities we look for, particularly in companies? It's a whole, the side of it from the standpoint of regulatory and public health we'll come back to, and I've spent a lot of time on in my day job. But to the companies and the organizations themselves, what do they need to build in to reduce that cycle time, to have that degree of not only responsiveness that Bob brought up, but also the anticipation of being ready for whatever the next challenge might be? I don't know, Jim or Stan, do you want to start on that? And then Bob, maybe
I can start. And, you know, I think, you know, as I step back, one of the lessons learned that I saw during this was that great scientists who are willing to take risks make a big difference. And, you know, I think you can really identify this. And back in 2018, one of our scientists championed a collaboration with the BioNTech in Germany on this gene therapy. And mRNA was interesting, but it was really unproven at the time. And we had one scientist who just believed in it so strongly and basically convinced the company to make a big investment in the area as a novel technology. And we've spent 2 years of investment in that technology starting. And by January 2020, we believe that could be the solution to the COVID-19. So one of the things that really you need to have some science. And actually we had a technology that we developed for SARS, solution for SARS. And what it required was more government funding back when, and the government decided not to fund it because SARS was kind of old news. It was taken care of. It wasn't a problem anymore. And actually the work on that technology led us and gave us confidence in this mRNA technology that ultimately solved the problem. So some of this is just scientific leadership. People, you know, and of course, Bob and Stan know this better than anybody else because this is their business. It's amazing to see somebody believes in something, but you have to recognize too that a lot of these things fail, and it gets very, very expensive. The failures are very expensive. They cost as much as the successes.
Yeah, again, all good points. Our situation is a bit different. We're a science company, so everybody in the company except me, I guess, I'm a scientist only because I've been managing science-based companies for 40 years, and I pick up some of it. But we're basically all scientists, and so you need the scientific leadership. But we've turned on a dime several times before. And when the gene sequence came out and the newspaper and the news started flowing in December, I guess, about this virus in China, and the gene sequence came out, we just stopped the company because we're in the middle of a phase 3 pivotal trial on a new influenza vaccine, which, by the way, turned out it's the best data I've ever had in my 40-year career, and nobody cares because and it's true. And we're sitting on a great flu vaccine because we have had no bandwidth to develop it once we got into SARS and COVID. And but we've in all this time, and so that makes management pretty easy. And I said we went from 150 people to 850 people. I have no trouble recruiting people when you've got a mission that's so clear, and the communication to everybody is so clear. People are, how many times in your lifetime are you going to be able to work on something as important as this is? And so that's the easy part, is recruiting people and getting focused. But getting to here, as I mentioned, we've worked on 5 or 6 different potential pandemic viruses, and invested my shareholders' money, well over $100 million, on things that we never got a dime for, because there was never a market for SARS. There's never a market for H7N9, never a market for it.
Mm-hmm.
And the government's been talking about it for 20 years, funding, how do we get ready for a pandemic? And some people were, they talked to deaf ears. Nobody ever got anything in place for this. And so now maybe they will. I don't know what's going to happen after this pandemic, whether they put in place the infrastructure to scale up. And it's all scale up. That's what's taking time.
And I think, I want to come back to you, Bob, with the question now. So there will be a post-pandemic period, or as a lot of us think, an intra-pandemic. It's just a matter of time again before we're dealing with something, whether on this scale or something more modest. In those time periods, what do we look for? What are the features of, as an investor, as an interested party in this space? What do you look for in the companies that are really preparing themselves well? Because Jim, we can unpack what's been said here, and Jim, you were one retention away from losing that scientist who might have gone on to other pursuits, or
that's right.
Your example, when you were forced to reduce the workforce a little bit, you might have lost the person with that right idea, was passionate around the particular approach you took. So Bob, are there structural things, cultural things, leadership things that you look to as being essential, either as an investor or just as an advocate, as you've talked about here, that say this is a company or this is an entity that's organized and positioned to actually not just respond, but to lead as we go forward?
Yeah, I mean, 2 kind of thoughts. One is about the environment itself. BioNTech and Moderna and Novavax almost all got out of infectious disease, and almost all came close to failure. So if you ran a Monte Carlo simulation of all of that, Novavax wouldn't be around in some of those, and clearly mRNA would not be in an infectious disease in many of them. So we got a bit lucky, and we're in a current policy debate about funding and tax rates and all of that thing, and that stuff matters. If you want a lot of long-term investment and stuff, you don't tax it at 43%, right? And so when you start eviscerating capital flows, maybe the mRNA companies and Novavax don't exist. If you took the bar 25% higher in the last 10 years when Novavax was running out of money, and then pivoted to infectious disease. I remember that chapter, and so I think that the general innovation environment and the way that you incentivize and reward things in this space is super important. And you can't go around saying, like, we want all of this stuff and we want all of this infrastructure, but we're going to tax it more. And you actually need to think about it the other way. You need to incentivize people who invest in manufacturing and reinventing things. And so what we're spending time on, and again, the reason kind of Resilience was created was to use American technologic advantage to reinvent the system, the way we make all of this stuff, so we can do it much faster. And when you have the clarity of purpose, I mean, you're right. Both Stan and Jim said this as well. Recruiting and retaining and focusing people. There's nothing like a pandemic to kind of explain to people why biotech matters, and why all of this matters, and why we should kind of invest in it. People have short memories, though, and I think that this isn't going to be kind of over, right? It's going to be less deadly over. until something else happens. So it won't be the last pandemic, and it may even not be the last version of this pandemic. So I think, you know, we need to create and retain a sense of urgency here. You know, if I was a bad actor, like I would be, you know, figuring out how to evade the existing vaccines with a pathologic virus, right? I mean, this is, so we need to actually anticipate and invest and treat this like it's still a crisis, even as it wanes. And right now you're seeing a bunch of epidemics, right? So, you know, the US and UK are kind of over the hump and are you know, close to what I would call like fear herd immunity, which isn't biologic herd immunity, but it's like, hey, we're not going to worry about this thing. And if you're stupid enough to go get it and you're not vaccinated, we don't care about you because mom is vaccinated now. And so we're like in this point where we're not going to be worried about it as much this summer. But in India, obviously, you see the other side of this, and in Africa, it's a big question mark as to where it goes. So I kind of still think we need to be freaking out a little bit, even though at least on this group, right, we should be freaking out continually, and the rest of the world and the rest of the country, starting with the US and the UK, can start calming down. But, you know, we're not through this, and we should be developing. I mean, Stan should be thinking about Nipah virus and pan Nipah virus and pan coronavirus and pan every other damn virus that we can get, because we don't know what Ted Kaczynski with a gene editing box is going to hit us with, right? But it's going to happen. And so those are the things we need to kind of take all this human capital that's focused and look at.
Jim, you look like you leaned forward. I don't know if you had a specific response, Jim. I was going to take.
No, I just, you know, the one of the things, the good things that, you know, results of a horrible situation like this is the development of the new technologies like the RNA, and really, you know, who knows where it would have been and what, you know, what applications we're working on until this happens. Now it looks like that could be a whole basis for even cancer research. So, you know, that opening of the opportunities, the investments that were made several years ago, and the response to this particular crisis has opened up science to, you know, just the solutions that are going to be ahead of us just from this technology are really exciting. So I think that gives us some you know, some cause for optimism. I think the problem is, you know, it's a little like solving cancer. Cancer's been around a long time. We know it's a big problem. So many people get it. It's so devastating to families and individuals. And we've thrown trillions at it, but, you know, we've made great strides, but you've got to keep going and going to keep up with the problem.
No, I think, you know, I'm going to pause for a second because we are getting some questions that are coming in, and we're going to turn to audience questions in about 10 minutes or so. So folks who have questions can put them in the chat, and they're forwarding on to me. We'll get to as many as we can. The other thing I just want to add is I hope the minutes can reflect. I share Bob's enthusiasm for investment in infectious diseases, both therapeutics and preventative. As someone who takes care of these patients and helps oversee a health system, we really want to make sure that goes on record from your moderator today as well. Let's come back to, and we hinted at some of the regulatory elements. Bob talked about some of the frustration in the kind of the go live, that final pathway, but obviously in this space, that interplay of politics, regulation, and so on becomes absolutely essential. And I don't know if Stan, if you want to say a little bit about what the experience, it's ongoing for you. Obviously, I don't want you to get into anything you can't share right now, but
Stan can't badmouth the FDA at this point.
Can't. You're right.
Stan, do you want to share some of your warm and fuzzy and really positive experiences and working with, but just thinking about the investment, because again, you talk about it, you know, and I know you're being shorthanded with it, but it's not all scientists there. There are folks who are there at Novavax and at Pfizer and elsewhere who are really charged with understanding and working this dynamic with the feds and international and other regulatory agents. Can you say a little bit about that investment and outlook and what the experience is like to date on that? Understanding, again, for those who don't know, Novavax in a sensitive point right now, so just stop me if
Bob's right. I almost can't talk. But we're dealing with the FDA. We're dealing with MHRA in the UK. We're dealing with EMA in Europe, and I just got back from Korea yesterday, and dealing with the Korean FDA equivalent, and they are all they're taking different approaches, and some are more stringent than others. Some are more flexible than others. And in part, it depends upon their perception of what the need is. I think, as I say, there's not a whole lot I can say right now, but they're certainly better. They're certainly more responsive than they have been in the past. And I think Jim had mentioned it takes 5 to 7 years to develop vaccines. Actually, that's not right. It takes 10 to 15 years to develop vaccines. What Jim's talking about is it takes 5 to 7 years to get when you inject your first human with a vaccine to the point where it's finished. But it's 5 to 10 years to get it to that point. And that's when you start dealing with the FDA. But you have to deal with these. In the past, in normal courses is you have to ask for a meeting, and the FDA has to respond within 75 days. 75 days is a lifetime in this. And so, and other agencies have different rules where you can pick up the phone and call them. And so it's better, but we've got a ways to go yet.
Yeah, just I can say things. So look, the FDA has done a 9 of 10, I mean, amazing job. But, and I would say the CDC is, in the guts of the CDC has also done a 9 of 10. In the leadership, it is, 0 of 10, but both the FDA and the CDC, I mean, at the beginning of this pandemic, sat on the data from the Seattle flu study for 3 weeks when they knew there was community spread going on in Seattle because they were worried about privacy. So they wouldn't even let people follow up, and it was and there was no, none of us knew what would happen, and you could go look at those things, but the institutional inertia, and worry about these kind of rules, right, needs to be re-examined in the context of we're in a fucking pandemic and a lot of people are dying and the world economy is breaking down, and I think people forget that when it takes 4 weeks to schedule something, right? We all know it doesn't take 4 weeks to schedule something. I call Albert Bourla in the middle of the night and he takes the call, right? So it's like, when we re-examine how to go faster, part of the re-examination is got to be our government institutions streamlining even more. I think they did an amazing job relative to what the past was, right? But again, just like private industry, it's not good enough. Neither our government response or our private industry response was good enough yet, right? Because all you have to do is look around at what's happening. And so I'm not saying we're striving for perfection, but we do have to, now, when we have the ability to take a pause and rethink this, think about how we can go better, faster, more integrated between government and private industry, more integrated in the funding, and investing in advance of problems. I mean, the biggest problem that we're all facing is that we're not investing in advance of this much. Novavax did, and BARDA did, but most people didn't, right? And so we need to create those incentives to fix the problems before they start. And, you can apply this to cyber as well. I mean, the two big threats I worry about all the time are kind of, biologic threats and cyber threats. And some are related. And, people are targeting all of our biologic companies right now, right? So So I just think we have to have there's a pause and sense of urgency. If we lose our sense of urgency here, we're going to be in trouble, because there is a 5 or 10% chance that you get a variant that gets around what we have.
Yeah, and I think it start, for all the stakeholders, right? It's how do we preserve that sense of urgency? There's an understandable, it's not so much a sense of relief, but so much as exhaustion as we get in some sectors of the world, but not others. Of, all right, we've gotten to this point, but then how do we actually accelerate again, so that 9 out of 10, as you described it, Bob, how do we carry that over in every agency and in every way of thinking? And that does apply back to, how we think about the politics of this as well, which is another whole panel and discussion for sure. What of the, and some of the questions that are coming, I'm getting a preview of some of the questions coming from the larger audience, and we'll turn very specifically to them. Can we talk a little bit about just the sense of civic mindedness, corporate responsibility, ethical obligation as you think about this kind of work? I mean, some might argue it's part and parcel of being involved in life sciences at any level, but at the same time, there are decisions that have to be made here that need to be done through the reflection of the greater society. I mean, Bob's brought us to some of these themes already, but how is that baked into these processes and decision making? It may be easy to answer in the setting of a global pandemic, but of a more routine nature as we go forward. How is that baked into the decision making, the investment, and the priorities in this space?
Well, I'll take it from my point of view, because as a small company, so we all know that the pandemic is not going to be solved unless you solve it globally. And so we are a company that was headquartered in Maryland and with offices, with facilities in Sweden. Back last summer, when it was clear that this is going to be global, and we agreed with our funders with the funders that we would have global access, equitable global access. So and normally, and to be, I guess, frank, we tend to develop products in the U.S. and Europe and high-income countries, and then ultimately, there's a lag of 5 to 10 years post-approval when pharmaceuticals get into low-income countries, and we knew this, and we've had the Gates Foundation has funded us for our activities over that last 10 years, at least a little bit of it, and so we talk that language. So we signed up with. We signed up with the largest vaccine company in the world in terms of volume, with the Serum Institute in India. They supply roughly 2/3 of the world's kids with vaccines for $1 or $2 a dose, and that's their business model. But they don't do anything in high-income countries. So we partnered up with them because we had a partnership on a malaria vaccine with them that is we've got a great malaria vaccine too, and we gave them. We made the decision. I made the decision that we would license them, no upfront fees, no milestone payments. We would transfer to them without any charge. And so we've been developing the product, and they're going to take care, because we can't distribute the product. Pfizer can. We can't distribute the product in 100 different countries, low-income countries. We don't have the distribution, the regulatory expertise, any of that. And so we just said, you do it. And they did, and they are doing it. And we're focusing on Europe and the U.S. and other countries, but we're doing it in parallel now. And so that's the global access that I think you have to have, particularly in a pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Let's do this. I'm keeping an eye on the clock and keeping an eye on the questions that are coming in. I'm going to turn to them, and I'll direct these perhaps on occasion to one or more of you, but also feel free to jump in. I apologize to those posing the questions. I don't have the attribution here, so I'm just going to be working from the questions themselves and maybe picking up some of the threads that have already come up in the discussion. So let me start with something, Bob, that actually spoke to what you alluded to about the global and inconsistent nature of the pandemic, about where things stand in different parts of the world. So The question comes in from an audience member. What do you think about the situation, UK, US versus India and Brazil? How could the world help other countries such as India and Brazil? So you're now the king of the world, Bob, and your outlook in terms of how do we actually think about making an impact in those places where the pandemic is surging or continuing to surge now?
Well, in the next few weeks, unfortunately, not much. So we can go through the motions of sending ventilators and sending all those things based on the logistics. You're going to see probably 20,000 people a day die in India in the next couple of weeks or this week. It probably is there now. The numbers are way understated that you're seeing. So 20,000 people a day is full on. This is the worst case scenario, worse than Brazil. Health system is what little they had is falling apart. So unfortunately, there's a human cost that we won't be able to impact a lot. And so, what's worked in the UK and the US is, and I would do it, hopefully Novavax gets out there quickly. But this is an example of why regulators should move Novavax more quickly, right? And so you need a single shot, whatever you can take, right? We should provide excess vaccines, whatever we got, into those places quickly with just single shot mRNA or whatever is available. Kind of that there's not going to be enough of that available, but you have to get to the point where the US did, which is you kind of have, 30% of the people had it, 30% of the people or 40% of the people are vaccinated, and the others, are on their own because they're making poor choices. But it doesn't break down the healthcare system, so it becomes manageable. And then the other thing we have to deal with, which nobody is dealing with, is how do you get as quickly as possible those immunosuppressed people vaccinated, frankly, with either mRNA or Novavax, but not the other vaccines. They're not good enough for the immunosuppressed people. So you really have to go after them with a specific type of vaccine. And J&J could be, it may be a one-shot vaccine in those people that are hard to reach, but it can't be one of the less effective vaccines in the immunosuppressed. So I think unfortunately, they're going to burn through it, and the Europe will be maybe 6 weeks behind the UK and the US. So you'll start seeing Europe come down now, and get to the point where the UK and the US feel, which is a psychological tipping point, not just a biologic tipping point, right? And the US is already there in many areas where it's waning, even though we're wearing masks.
That's great. I'm going to pivot a little bit. Jim, early on in your remarks, you talked about sort of challenging folks to get from 18 months to 9 months, I think was the number. We had one of our audience members ask, do you think, maybe inspired by your comments, do you think based on the knowledge we've gained now, we could do this in 6 months in the future?
I think we can do it pretty fast if the technology is applicable. Mm-hmm. In other words, if RNA technology can, mRNA technology can be applied. The reason it was first invested in was because flu vaccines are about 60% effective. And we said this new technology will enable us to figure out what strain of flu is coming and very quickly adapt the vaccine to the problem. So by its very nature, this technology is one that you can move very quickly on. And once you figure out the genetic, I'm no scientist, but the scientists tell me once you can figure it, you can modify it very quickly. So that's a real breakthrough. Yeah, I think we can get really quickly, and you can already see it. We started out at 80 degrees centigrade. They had to ship the stuff. Now we've figured out ways with some ingredients and other things that, you're going to have much more stable, much more easy to manage supply chain as we go forward. And that's one of the big investments we're making now to the next level of technology. How do you make it even easier and quicker? to deliver.
We can make the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine on a chip in 22 days in a fully enclosed GMP system. So you know, the new manufacturing paradigm won't look anything like a cold chain. You know, eventually, and you know, I'm sure that Stan is figuring out like how to work on supply chains every moment of his day.
I think, Stan, I was going to turn to you because obviously the ambition, and we've had a question specifically about mRNA technology and some of the themes that Jim and Bob just referenced, but Bob provides the intro too. There's got to be lessons learned in terms of the development here, as well as for the previous coronavirus vaccines and the others that you've said, that gives you the ambition to reduce that cycle time from discovery to deployment. What are you seeing in that space in terms of the technology and the approach that is used at Novavax?
Yeah, so we have more of a biologic manufacturing issue, and you can't change cells. Mammalian cells double roughly every day, and so you have to get to a scale, and it takes roughly 30 days to get to multi-thousand liter scale, and so that's just the nature of the thing. You could learn a lesson. I won't get too detailed in this. You could always have a continuing process where you've got 20 days worth of growth behind you, and then just keep refreshing that. That can do it. And you know, and the other thing is are we going to? Is the U.S. going to support the scale in place that's not used in an inter-pandemic period, and that's a lesson that we've been trying to learn, at least in my whole career that we've been doing pandemic, is that there's never been enough money put at it. You know, BARDA and other U.S. government, you know, they'll put $50 million or $100 million into it. We just realize that if you throw $20 billion into it, that's probably enough, and it's peanuts compared to what the pandemic costs, right? So that might be a lesson learned. I'm not confident that will be a lesson learned, but it might be.
Richie, so there's two things you have to have, right? It's not just a bunch of plants, right? That you turn off and turn on, because that doesn't work. Actually, it's the human capital that is the short part here. You know, you can build all the vaccine plants you want. There's probably about 20 guys in the world or women that know how to run them. And you have to keep them exercised all the time, like a special forces group, right? So they have to be working on some problem all the time.
Right.
And then when the pandemic comes, you flex them into that problem. And the second thing you have to do is anticipate the problem, so you're not reacting, right? So when we have you know, that Stan makes a pan coronavirus and a pan Nipah virus, and you know, so we have things in the freezer partly scaled that we can nip these things in the bud. I mean, if we would have nipped this in the bud in Wuhan, you know, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And you know, you can also do that with monoclonal antibodies, where you freeze down a bunch of antibodies that are pan something, right? And so that you can, what you want to try to do is slow the spread. And we learned, you know, lots of lessons. I mean, one of the fascinating lessons I think we've learned that we haven't implemented is, when you looked at Wuhan, they declared a quarantine, told everybody when it was going to happen, and then 3 million people left, populated the world with coronavirus. Italy got on fire. They declared a quarantine, told everybody what was going to happen. They all went to New York, you know, and then New York declared a quarantine, waited 7 days, and they all left and went the rest of the country. And you could see it in Brazil and India, you know, when if you're dealing with transmissible virus, the human decisions you make are super important. And the leadership, you know, back to Jim's original point, is like really important. And so you can imagine this pandemic. We should view it I view it as kind of the fear of the virus. So right now, the US is going into a phase where we're not going to fear the virus, and the UK, and then others will follow. And I've been traveling around a lot in the US in the last month, and we're getting there. and then the biology will catch up with that, right? That doesn't mean people won't die, but people die all the time of driving around with no helmet on motorcycles too, and so you're gonna, and they die of flu, and they die. So you're gonna get to this point where it's not that there's gonna be human tragedy, but the fear is down. Interestingly, the people who have controlled the virus well, like China and Taiwan, are still gonna fear the virus.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting. So the US, at a cost of 600,000 people, is going to get to a place where the US and the UK are kind of ahead of the rest of the world in the weirdest way, even of the people who are just locked down. So China's still going to be locked down, right? It's very hard to vaccinate 1.4 billion people in China, and we're going to be sitting here percolating at herd immunity. And you never would have bet that would be the case. But I think that's where we're headed, is that part of the world's going to be all freaked out about the virus for the next couple of years. And part of it's going to be just, all right, we're done.
Yeah, Bob, I think that notion around calibrating the fear level to a productive place is something I know we see at the bedside and through to global policy. Maybe on that note, and thinking, and I want to come back to something that you all touched on that was in line with one of the questions, that maintaining that fear, apprehension, awareness, commitment, however you want to frame it. One of our audience members asked, how can private capital play a role in ensuring there's good infrastructure for the future? You're talking about infrastructure a moment ago, but maybe when the attention has passed in the US or UK from what's it going to look like as an attractive investment for private capital around infrastructure to support vaccines, biologics, and others?
And that's what we're building at Resilience, right? We started it to build that. And we haven't had any problem accessing capital, right? And the government is going to all governments are going to put a lot of money into this, because it turns out, we learned this in the 2003 flu, and I think Jim and Stan saw this as well, which is, everybody's altruistic except they aren't. So they're altruistic after they serve their own domestic interests. Yeah. And that applies to every single country you can think of. And when, France was talking about altruism, on the other line, Macron was calling up Stan and Albert Bourla and everybody else saying, where's France's vaccine? I want my vaccine first. And so, I was just on the, phone this week with a senior African health minister who's coordinating the African response. And they have the same view, which is, hey, we can't rely on the West. We want to make our own vaccines.
Right.
And so that's the thing that, they need to think about is, and everybody will think about, is how to create their own infrastructure, because they don't trust each other anymore. Nope.
I'm curious. I actually want to hear, Stan, because early on you acknowledged sort of the difference in Novavax and Pfizer in terms of some of the logistics and distribution. So maybe that question to you in terms of, and it looked like you may want to chime in on it too, the idea of private capital separately funding the kind of infrastructure that allows for this. Is that something that resonates for you, or that you have an outlook on?
Yeah, a bit, but I spent my whole life, my whole career, trying to access private capital, and whether it's as a non-public company or as a public company, either way. And I don't think you would get any investment in pandemic infrastructure. I think it has to be government, and they have to step forward. And if they step forward, private capital will come along with them. But there's got to be some commitment of doing that. So
yeah. There's been a couple of questions on a theme here. I'm going to take the language from maybe the most recent query. I'm going to put it, Jim, first to you from a kind of a governance standpoint on things. And the question is this: in the present global context, how do vaccine manufacturers strike a balance between their social and commercial aspects of their mission? That is, to ensure widespread and equitable access to vaccines, yet without undermining the incentive for innovation. This question has been framed in a lot of different ways, some more positive, some less constructive.
No, it's one of the,
a critical question, no matter how it's framed. And I think
it's one of the hardest issues, because as you think about, a lot of the analysts have raised the question just in the course of, how companies are valued. One of the issues is, just think of the coronavirus. It cost me $75 to $150 to find out if I had it. And I had to take tests all the time to go places and be there. And the solution was $19 a dose for the cure to the problem. It took, I spent $750 at least just getting tested to see if I had it. And here the cure costs $19. So how do you decide on how to price something like this? And it's one of the key challenges of all drug development. And I'm sure, between Bob and Stan, they deal with it all the time too, is how do you price, something that you spent millions on, and then you've spent millions on other things that have failed and that you just had to bury, and do you recover part of your costs there? How do you think about, what the right pricing and how you execute your moral responsibility in a pandemic? So it was certainly something that is discussed at every boardroom, I'm sure, across the country. And, the general thing is do the right thing. People will say, do the right thing, but what's the right thing? And that's not one of the hardest discussions you will have as a board member.
And if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I have a board meeting tomorrow. We've now gotten board meetings. We have a Saturday morning with Stan every Saturday now, instead of having it every quarter, because so much is going on. It moves so fast, and we talk about this. We signed we announced an agreement with something called Gavi and COVAX, which is this fund to fund vaccines and distribution globally, and the focus is on low-income countries. So we announced that we will provide 1.1 billion doses to low-income countries through this thing, and so that's what you do. And yeah, the $19 vaccine is one analysis we did. You just do cost benefit analysis, and this is before the total cost was known, but this is 9 months ago, and it came out. It should be priced at $300 a dose, and so there's economic justification if you just base it on that to have a multi-$100 vaccine. But so Pfizer took the lead and at $19, and there's prices settled all around that range, and so that's part of your global responsibility, I think.
And part of it is to create manufacturing infrastructure that's dual use, right? So it turns out that a lot of, think of the way technology is going to be miniaturized. Manufacturing will be miniaturized and systematized and digitized, and a lot of these and decentralized. Even though right now we're going central, but in 5 or 10 years, it's not going to be. And so I think, and what it turns out, those same technologies are going to be very useful for gene therapy and cell therapy and all of the gene editing and all of the forefront of biologic therapies that we think about. So these same kind of technologies and manufacturing infrastructure can be used for other things. And so, when you're dealing with a viral vector, that can be a viral vector for a vaccine. It can be a viral vector for a gene therapy. And so systematically investing in these platform technologies is how we're going to get ahead of this. So, we actually haven't invested in manufacturing proactively much at all in this space. It's always an afterthought because it was always about pills. And the only people that actually invested in manufacturing were vaccine makers, right? And they were actually,
that's right.
That's why there aren't very many of them, and the barriers to entry are wickedly high, and with the old technologies. But with the new technologies, they may not be. I have a unit in one of my companies, where you can, it's the size of a small refrigerator, and it makes mRNA, and so and it makes it GMP. So I think the future is going to be different than the past, but we do need governments to invest in the R&D piece of this as well, and also to create the incentives and maintain the incentives. This idea that, you know, the public should do this, like government should solve this. Like, you know, government doesn't make tanks and missiles, and, you know, national defense is our number one priority, right? That's the reason that governments exist first. And it turns out, like, you know, they don't make any of that stuff. They private contractors make that stuff. So governments need to figure out a way to incentivize and pay for things. And when they're dual use, you can get the human capital working all the time, so it actually works. Because if you just pay for it and wait for the next pandemic, we're going to be, you know, in a place where we're rerunning the same movie.
Let me stay in the policy space on that. And you know, to the extent that these transitions have been smooth, I owe to the people who are putting in questions where there's some sort of mind meld that's gone on between the panel and the audience, because you're tracking on a lot of similar themes. But I'm going to use, and thank you all for the many questions. But I as moderator, I get to pick the ones that I'm really interested to hear particularly to. And the last one that came in right now is one that tracks with some of that. And it's the notion of, to the panel, what do you think about this whole notion of vaccine diplomacy? And the questioner says, as deployed by China and Russia, but obviously we've seen vaccine diplomacy being applied globally at different times, including from the US, of leveraging vaccine availability, production, access, or otherwise as a tool in international relations. So kind of a big question, but I'm going to put it to the group and see if this is something that's been talked about at the from within the companies, at the governance. I'm guessing Bob has some thinking on this. But first, for Stan and Jim, do you have a particular outlook?
Well, I would say when politics are intertwined with a public health crisis, the unintended consequence is confusion and distrust. So, you know, you could clearly, you know, instead of prospectively, let's look back at, you know, what happened during this crisis. You know, the communication wasn't united, wasn't transparent, wasn't always backed by science. We were in the middle of an election year, a heated Democratic primary, and the rhetoric around the development of this vaccine was unbelievable. Some people were saying you're moving too fast. You're going to, you know, danger people. Other people, you're moving too slow. We're not making enough investments. You know, we're trying to fill a gallon jug. We should fill it more quickly. Will the science be compromised? All these things, when you get into the politics, the last thing these drug companies need is sniping by politicians as they're trying to come up with solutions for some of these things. I guess that would be my observation.
Fair enough.
Yeah, and mine is on a smaller scale. Diplomacy in terms of using trading this for some other greater goal. Mine's on a basis. So I've got 15 months ago, I had zero manufacturing capacity, zero. And now I've got manufacturing capacity in 4 continents and 8 different locations. And I have to get raw materials around the globe, and I have to get approvals around the globe. And right now, my biggest frustration is, can I get raw materials from the US to my European plant, or vice versa? Can I get it to my Indian plant? And once I have a vaccine, will the EU or the US let us, that we've made it there, will they let us ship it to name a country? And it's just, you have to, in my view, you have to have open borders, particularly during a pandemic. In not just the vaccine goes places, but the raw materials that go into making them. And Pfizer has a lot of the same problems as getting things across borders. And so those are my political problems right now.
That's fair. Bob?
Well, you know, I think that some countries have engaged in, you know, clear horse trading. And I think the US should avoid horse trading, but we should be much more proactive in our direct relationships with countries to provide them vaccine. We have the best vaccines, and we should get them out there. And that's actually in the world's interest too, because having a bunch of less good vaccine out there is, plays into this kind of variant problem that we may have. So I just think that we shouldn't let our foot off the gas in production of mRNA and Novavax. The US should fund the hell out of them, make as much, billions and billions and billions of doses, and provide them to everyone, the whole world. And that has always been the characteristic of US leadership. I mean, this is a classic one, right? Where we're both better at the technology and the altruism part, even though altruism is always under the filter of your national interests first. But we're kind of done with that, and every country will do that. They'll pretend not to, and then they'll do it anyway. And then and even with supply chains. But now we're at a point where the US should just be absolutely making as much of this as we can and getting it everywhere, because frankly we have the best vaccines. It's not even a diplomatic thing, it's a biologic thing. Like, we have better vaccines, and we should get them into as many arms as we can.
I'm guessing the panel would be unanimous in that assessment.
Yeah. That's right.
We're going to be down to the last couple of minutes. I think it's good in, this has been a serious topic, obviously, and with a lot of dark undertones in terms of the pandemic. But let's end on an optimistic note. Again, this is not about a silver lining. This is just a projection forward to each of you. 5 years from now, what's our best case scenario with what we've learned and what we might do with respect to vaccine development in the context of this pandemic? Bob, we've heard some of the darker views that might come, but give us some good news about what it might look like if follow.
I think we're going to be, I think we'll have decentralized manufacturing all over the place. We will have predicted the next viruses, and we will in advance, make those pan vaccines. We'll have better treatment technology than we do now to have pan viral therapeutics in case things happen, and even pan bacterial therapeutics. So I think the investment will be productive, and we probably won't have to rerun this movie. There'll be another movie, right? And it may be a deadlier virus, right? This isn't the worst case scenario virus. So by any means, so I think we'll have, and we'll have better world coordination. I think the thing that I don't know is will we have better information flow? Like, are people just gonna, will we know what we need to know when we need to know it?
We had to keep it to a positive end, so we're gonna cut you off. Stan, go ahead.
So I think it's like this moonshot. I mean, how many products came out of learnings from going into space? It's the same thing. HIV had the same effect. We know so much more. I spent 10 years trying to develop an HIV drug back in the 80s, and 90s, and there's so much more known about viruses that because of the work that went in there, and it's the same thing here. We're gonna learn how to make. I mean, look at what mRNA has done. I mean, it's gone from zero, as Jim mentioned, to it's going to be used in a whole host of diseases, prevention and treatment. And so coming out of knowledge will make much better vaccines in the future, much better products that are not vaccines. So.
All right, Jim.
I would add that, if governments don't tax and regulate us out of business, I'm very optimistic about what the private sector can do over time.
Yeah.
All right. Well, listen, I want to extend, on behalf of the audience, want to extend my gratitude to the panelists. I, for one, found this really stimulating, instructive. I just want to add in closing, you know, as somebody again is working closer to the bedside, I'm really grateful to the work that all of you have done and the thinking that you've stimulated, the way you've challenged public health, government affairs, and your own companies and your own work. I think there's been a benefit to it, and we pointed out there's a long way to go and still a lot we need to do on this pandemic and readiness for the next one. But I'm really grateful to all of you for today and for the work that you do in general. So thank you.